A quiet village, a perfect roast, and one chilling secret buried beneath the gravy. Welcome to the Mysterious Casebook. I am your host, Michael. Tell me, where in the world are you listening from today? It means so much to hear from you. Drop a comment and let me know. Now let's step into the mystery. The scent of rosemary lamb wafted through the open window of the vicarage kitchen, curling through the hedgerows like a silent invitation. It was the second Sunday of September, brisk, golden, and just warm enough that the ladies of St. Mary Mead had opted for silk scarves over felt hats. In the dining room, the table gleamed with polish and traditional Staffordshire plates arranged with military precision, mismatched yet lovingly mended napkin rings, and a pot of Coleman's mustard placed exactly 3 inches from the salt cellar. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Maud Clement, surveyed it all with a faint sigh of satisfaction. Every second Sunday was her domain, a post-service roast shared among an assortment of villagers. She felt it her Christian duty to include the lonely, the overlooked, and the too talkative. The conversation was always the same. Village notices, lukewarm praise for the sermon, and the scandal of the moment. This Sunday's guests included Colonel Archibald Fenton, retired, irascible, and still insistent on punctuality as a moral imperative. Miss Dorothy "Dotty" Cray, a paint-spattered amateur artist who was likely older than she admitted. Mr. Harold Pike, the young solicitor's clerk with suspiciously polished fingernails. And, seated near the begonias in the sunniest corner, Miss Jane Marple. The roast was perfectly tender, pink in the middle, and ringed with crisped potatoes, and the conversation flowed politely until Dotty Cray leaned in, her voice a stage whisper. "I saw her again last night, behind the post office. Same ridiculous blue coat and that cat following her." Colonel Fenton bristled. "That'll be Nora Bledsoe. Gone round the bend, that one. Talks to the cat more than she ever talked to her husband." "She says he still visits her," Dotty added, as though sharing a bit of spiritual news. Mr. Pike let out a short laugh. "Pity he's been dead 6 months. More likely she's talking to her guilty conscience. If you ask me, that woman knows more than she lets on." Miss Marple sipped her weak lemon tea, her gaze mild. "Grief takes peculiar forms," she said gently, "especially when one lives alone." Maud Clement cleared her throat. "Well, we all grieve differently. Nora's always been a bit eccentric." "But not dangerous," Dotty murmured, stabbing a carrot with unnecessary force. The meal continued, spiced with speculation. Nora Bledsoe's name hung over the pudding like a bitter aftertaste. It was only the next morning that Mrs. Clement discovered the scandal had cooked itself into something far more ghastly than gossip. For just as she was reaching into the bread box for the breakfast toast rack, the front bell rang. She opened the door to find Constable Arnold standing solemn-faced, his notebook already in hand. "Terribly sorry to disturb your morning, ma'am," he said, removing his helmet. "It's Mrs. Bledsoe, found this morning in her parlor. Dead." Mrs. Clement staggered back, one hand to her chest. "Good heavens, not of natural causes?" "Afraid not. There's a roast in the oven, burnt to a crisp, but the poor woman never made it to supper." He lowered his voice. "Looks like poisoning." Miss Marple, later informed by Mrs. Clement over a trembling cup of tea, said nothing at first. Her knitting lay untouched in her lap as she stared out over her garden, where the chrysanthemums were just beginning to bloom. "A roast," she murmured. "It's always the small things, food, habits, little rituals. They tell one everything." Her tone was calm, but her pale eyes had sharpened with interest. In the heart of St. Mary Mead, Sunday had always been sacred. But now, it seemed, murder had been served alongside the Yorkshire pudding. And as the village buzzed with theories, some sensible, most absurd, Miss Marple began, in her usual quiet way, to watch, to listen, and to remember. For in a village where everything was visible, It was human nature that remained hidden, and that, she knew, was where the truth would lie. St. Mary Mead, for all its charm and carefully clipped hedges, possessed a remarkable speed at which news could travel. By Monday afternoon, the entire village knew that Nora Bledsoe had been found dead with her supper untouched, and her cat mewling pitifully beside her. That it was likely poison and not old age or melancholy that had robbed her of life added a dash of ghastly fascination. The tea tables of St. Mary Mead overflowed not only with jam tarts and ginger biscuits, but also with speculation. In the High Street, Mrs. Beale, proprietress of the greengrocers and a woman who considered herself a moral compass for the village, declared with absolute certainty that it was suicide. "She's been peculiar for months," she said, bagging carrots for Mrs. Nash, talking to shadows, setting 2 places at tea. She missed her husband terribly, poor soul. Mrs. Nash shook her head. But poison? That takes planning. It's not the sort of thing you do in the spur of grief. Mrs. Beale narrowed her eyes, unless it was something she kept for just such a day. You know what they say. Widows carry more in their cupboards than just jam. Behind them, Miss Hartwell, who taught Sunday school with a zeal typically reserved for missionaries in foreign lands, tutted disapprovingly. "We ought not to speculate," she murmured. "It's unseemly. The police will get to the bottom of it." Yet even as she spoke, her gaze flicked toward the window, as though expecting the constable himself to appear, notepad in hand. Meanwhile, at the Red Fox Inn, the conversation was far less delicate. "She had it coming," barked Albert Trowbridge, the village handyman and self-appointed pub philosopher, always poking her nose where it didn't belong. "I thought she was cleverer than the rest of us." His drinking companion, Frank Ellis, who had once been turned away from the Bledsoe residence for using unladylike language within earshot of Nora, grunted in agreement. "I wouldn't be surprised if someone helped her along." "You saying she was murdered?" asked the innkeeper, pulling a pint with the slow, deliberate rhythm of someone who liked to listen more than speak. "I'm saying," said Frank, leaning in conspiratorially, "that she made enemies. And enemies sometimes don't just mutter and move on. Sometimes they act." Across the village, at the lace-draped front window of Miss Marple's cottage, the detective in question sat with a pair of ivory-handled scissors in hand, clipping dead blooms from her geraniums. Her movements were methodical, absent-minded, but her mind was far from tranquil gardening. She had known Nora Bledsoe since the days of her marriage to Harold Bledsoe, a rather colorless bank manager with little ambition, but a tidy moustache and a fondness for stamps. Their life had been quiet, not quite content, but serviceable. After Harold's unexpected death earlier that year, a fall down the stairs, declared accidental, though whispers had circulated briefly, Nora had become a fixture of solitary routines and strange mutterings. But madness did not, Miss Marple knew, preclude danger, nor did it guarantee a self-inflicted end. She rose slowly, walking over to the little round table by the window where her notebook lay open. A list had already begun to take form, names, impressions, and possibilities. Mrs. Clement, dear Maud, had been terribly shaken. Miss Cray had been unnaturally eager to malign Nora's character. Colonel Fenton had dismissed the entire affair with bluster, but he had arrived at the Sunday lunch with a faint stain on his sleeve. Gravy, perhaps, or something else entirely. And then there was young Harold Pike, who had been notably quiet during the meal. Miss Marple recalled how he had toyed with his spoon while Dottie Cray spun her tale, never once looking up, and how he had declined second helpings, most unlike a young man with an appetite. Of course, none of this amounted to anything more than passing observations. And yet, that afternoon, Miss Marple took her usual walk through the village, not along the bustling high street, but down the quieter lanes, where gossip hummed like bees in the hedgerows. She passed the post office, where Miss Barnes was sorting envelopes with uncommon ferocity, and offered a gentle nod. "Terrible business about Mrs. Bledsoe," Miss Marple said, her voice mild. Miss Barnes looked up. "Oh, it's awful, Miss Marple, though I can't say I'm surprised. I always thought there was something strange about her. She posted a letter just 2 days ago, you know, marked personal." "Did she now? How curious. She never sent personal letters, not since Harold passed. Always bills or magazine subscriptions." Miss Marple tilted her head. "You wouldn't happen to know the recipient?" "Didn't look, of course," Miss Barnes said primly. "But it had one of those wax seals. Red. A bit theatrical for a woman like her, don't you think?" "Perhaps. Or perhaps theatrical was precisely what she wanted at the end." Miss Marple walked on, turning the information over in her mind like a stone with a secret side. She passed the Bledsoe house shortly after. It had been cordoned off with a single length of twine, more symbolic than practical. The curtains were drawn, and a thin line of smoke still drifted from the kitchen chimney, a leftover ghost of a dinner that had never been eaten. A cluster of marigolds lined the path. They were overgrown, tangled, and deeply orange. Miss Marple stooped to examine them. Beneath one stalk, almost hidden by soil and petal, was a small corked vial. She did not touch it. That would be foolish, but she stared at it for a long time before rising and walking on, her steps no longer as aimless as they appeared. That evening, after supper, she rang up Inspector Craythorne. "I thought I might have a word," she said sweetly, "about something I noticed near Mrs. Bledsoe's marigolds. Quite possibly nothing, of course. But then again, as I've always said, it's the smallest things that matter." The inspector, who had learned by now never to underestimate the polite vagueness of Miss Jane Marple, agreed to call round the next morning. By then, a new whisper had begun to circulate quietly, but was gaining speed. Someone had seen Dottie Cray near the Bledsoe house on Saturday evening, just after sundown, with a parcel under one arm, and Miss Marple, knitting in her rose-patterned chair, was already several stitches ahead. The next morning dawned pale and cool, the sort of weather that left dew clinging to every rose petal and made the chimneys of St. Mary Mead puff like thoughtful old men. Life in the village pretended to carry on as usual. Post was delivered, milk bottles clinked at doorsteps, and the bakery opened its shutters to reveal fresh loaves lined up like soldiers on parade. But beneath the ordinary hum of activity, something coiled and watchful stirred. The knowledge that one of their own had died by poison, intentional and deliberate, settled into every crack of the cobbled streets. Miss Marple's cottage remained quiet, except for the steady tick of the long-case clock in the parlor and the rustle of her fingers over her knitting. She had chosen grey wool this morning, cool, neutral, and practical. The shawl forming beneath her needles was not for warmth, but for thought. At precisely 9:30, Inspector Craythorne arrived. He was a sensible man with thick brows and thinning patience, but over the years he had come to value Miss Marple's curious blend of innocence and intuition. She always began with pleasantries, spoke of the weather, perhaps inquired after his sister's lumbago, and then, without fuss, slid something significant across the table. Today, it was a single sentence. "There's a small vial beneath the marigolds at the Bledsoe residence." The inspector's pencil paused mid-scribble. "A vial?" Miss Marple nodded. "Corked. Quite ordinary looking, but rather out of place in a flower bed. I saw it yesterday afternoon while on my walk." "You didn't touch it?" "Heavens, no. I expect there are fingerprints if the weather has been kind." Craythorne made a note, then looked up. "And what, may I ask, makes you so certain it's related?" "I'm not certain of anything," Miss Marple replied mildly. "Only that it seems rather like someone wanted something hidden but not thrown away, as if they hoped to retrieve it later." The inspector stared at her for a moment, then nodded slowly. By 10 o'clock, The marigolds had been carefully parted, and the vial retrieved by a constable in white gloves. Its contents would be tested, of course, but there was an immediate sour, almondy scent that even Miss Marple, standing a safe distance away, recognized from a long-ago case involving an ambitious niece and a very wealthy aunt. Cyanide. Back in the village, word of the discovery had not yet spread, but other threads of suspicion were beginning to fray. At the Red Fox Inn, two farmers debated the likelihood of Dotty Cray's involvement, their reasoning flimsy but enthusiastic. She was jealous of Nora's garden, one claimed. She said it blocked the light from her shed. Oh, and she always hated cats, added the other with a solemn nod, as if feline disdain were proof enough of a criminal mind. Meanwhile, Dotty Cray herself was in her cottage, furiously scrubbing at a green smear on her smock. Her watercolors half finished the table, and a cup of tea stood forgotten by the window. When Miss Marple knocked gently at her door, Dotty startled and immediately tried to hide the smock behind her. "Jane! Oh, what a morning! Do come in. I'm afraid it's a frightful mess." Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the palette-streaked sink and the hastily draped smock. "Art is rarely tidy. I've always admired that about you, Dotty. You create your own kind of order." Dotty gave a weak smile and fussed with the kettle. "Sugar. Just one, thank you." Miss Marple paused before adding, "You were seen near Nora Bledsoe's house on Saturday evening." The cup rattled slightly as Dotty poured. "Well, yes, I passed by on my way back from the church. I'd left a sketchbook behind after Thursday's group session. I thought it best to collect it while the light was still good. A parcel was mentioned. Someone saw you carrying one." Dotty's eyes darted to the side. "Oh, yes. Just some paper and supplies. I'd bought them in town and hadn't had time to drop them off before heading to the church." Miss Marple took her tea and sipped. "Quite understandable. And did you happen to see Nora that evening?" The house was dark. I thought she'd gone to bed early." "She did that sometimes." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "It's curious, isn't it, how much we think we know of our neighbors' habits and how little we truly see." There was no accusation in her voice, only a gentle melancholy that made Dotty fidget. "I didn't poison her, Jane," she said at last. "I may not have liked her, but I couldn't." "No, I don't suppose you could," said Miss Marple, setting down her cup. "But someone did, and I imagine it wasn't over something as small as a garden or a cat." She rose to go, offering a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank you for the tea, dear. And if you think of anything odd from that evening, I hope you'll let me know." Dotty nodded, and after the door closed behind her visitor, she sat heavily, staring at the smock in her lap as if it might accuse her. Elsewhere in the village, Maud Clement was baking. It was her method of coping: knead, mix, stir, and measure, and the scent of cinnamon and cloves drifted through the vicarage like balm, so says she was, in some ways, more affected by Nora's death than most. They had been friendly acquaintances, bound by the fragile threads of shared luncheons and seasonal charity efforts. She jumped slightly when Miss Marple arrived at the back door. "Jane!" "You startled me. I do apologize. I was wondering if you had a moment." They sat in the kitchen, and Miss Marple asked about the Sunday roast, the final shared meal before the tragedy. Maud's recollections were sharp, perhaps too sharp. She remembered who had eaten what, who had declined pudding, and who had looked restless during the vicar's grace. "She seemed agitated that day," Maud said suddenly, referring to Nora. "Quiet, yes, but with something behind the eyes, as if she were waiting for something." "Did she speak much?" "No more than usual. But she left early. She said she had to check on the roast she'd left in the oven. It seemed an odd excuse. Really, it was only just past 4. Hardly dinner time." Miss Marple tucked that detail away. "Do you recall who walked her to the gate?" "I believe it was young Mr. Pike. Such a polite young man." He offered to carry her umbrella. Harold Pike again. That made twice now he had brushed the edges of the case without stepping fully into the light. Miss Marple took her leave shortly after, declining a cinnamon bun but complimenting the aroma. Her mind was already elsewhere, spiraling inward through a web of chance meetings, withheld truths, and misplaced parcels. By nightfall, she had finished her grey shawl. She laid it out flat, smoothing the edges with practiced fingers. There was, she believed, a motive hiding in plain sight, not in the flowers or the roast or even the vial, but in the lives behind them, and she intended to find it stitch by careful stitch. On Tuesday morning, as the mist reluctantly lifted from the thatched roofs of St. Mary Mead, the town seemed unusually subdued. The quiet was not of peace, but of held breath, each villager waiting, watching, murmuring through lace-curtained windows. The shock of Nora Bledsoe's death had not yet faded, and as the whispers turned to murmurs and murmurs into full-fledged theories, one thing became increasingly apparent. The poison had not only taken a life, it had disturbed the fragile equilibrium of village life. At precisely 10 minutes past 9, Miss Marple stepped out of her cottage, wearing her dove-grey gloves and her mauve cardigan, the one with tiny shell buttons and the faint scent of lavender from last season's sachets. She carried her handbag, though there was nothing of urgency inside, and made her way toward the solicitor's office above the greengrocer's. The building was narrow and whitewashed, with ivy creeping up one side like a scandal slowly revealed. The solicitor, Mr. Edgar Hollis, was a solemn, tidy man who wore waistcoats regardless of season, and had inherited both the practice and a remarkably uncomfortable wingback chair from his father. When Miss Marple entered the waiting area, she was greeted not by Mr. Hollis, but by his junior clerk, Mr. Harold Pike. He rose at once, startled, smoothing a non-existent crease from his sleeve. "Miss Marple, is there something I can help you with?" Miss Marple smiled sweetly. "I thought I might drop in to speak with Mr. Hollis regarding a matter of church documentation. Just a formality, really." Mr. Pike hesitated, then nodded. "He's with a client at the moment. If you'd care to wait." She settled herself comfortably on the tufted chair by the window and retrieved her knitting. The needles clicked gently, a soft rhythm that filled the silence. Mr. Pike returned to his desk, though he glanced toward her more than once. His fingers tapped restlessly at a stack of correspondence, and a thin film of perspiration formed at his brow. "You knew Mrs. Bledsoe, I think," Miss Marple said at length, her tone conversational. Mr. Pike blinked. "Oh, yes. Yes, of course. She was a client. Not mine. I mean, not directly, but Mr. Hollis has handled her affairs for years. She was a widow," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "But I believe her husband's estate was somewhat modest." Mr. Pike frowned slightly. "Yes, well, Mr. Bledsoe was cautious with his savings, but Nora inherited a small sum from an aunt last spring. That, combined with a life insurance policy, put her in comfortable circumstances. I imagine such circumstances would require occasional legal maintenance." Mr. Pike said nothing. Miss Marple glanced up from her knitting. "It's strange, isn't it? How people assume the affairs of the elderly are always simple, but they can be rather tangled. Wills, amendments, secrets." At that, Mr. Pike's fingers stilled. "I really couldn't say, Miss Marple." "Oh, of course not, dear boy. I was only wondering whether she'd made any recent changes." Mr. Pike hesitated. "She may have drafted a codicil, but I can't discuss client matters, you understand." "Quite right," Miss Marple replied. "Quite right indeed." Mr. Hollis emerged a few minutes later, and Miss Marple rose with a smile, making no mention of codicils or client matters. Her visit, as it turned out, was brief and wholly benign, something about updating donation documentation for the parish flower fund. But as she left, her mind lingered not on petals, but on patterns. That same afternoon, a new name entered the conversation. "I say," whispered Mr. Ellis to Colonel Fenton over a game of draughts at the Red Fox Inn. "Did you know that Mrs. Bledsoe was seen arguing with her lodger last week?" "Lodger?" grunted the colonel. "Didn't know she had one. I only took him in about 2 months ago. Quiet fellow, name of Lennox. He claims he's writing a book, but no one's seen him set pen to paper. Keeps odd hours, too. Lights on at all hours of the night." Colonel Fenton narrowed his eyes. "Bit of a mystery man, eh?" "Too clean," Ellis muttered. "Never trust a lodger who doesn't leave so much as a muddy footprint." By dusk, the entire village knew about Mr. Lennox. Miss Marple, naturally, had already been aware. Her walks had taken her past the Bledsoe house too many times to miss the thin figure with spectacles and a suspiciously spotless mackintosh. But she had not, until now, placed him on her mental list of potential motives. The next morning, she made her way once again to the Bledsoe residence. The front gate now bore a notice from the constabulary, but Constable Arnold, familiar with Miss Marple's credentials of observation, allowed her a moment to observe from the garden. The marigolds had been disturbed and now stood withered under too much scrutiny. Miss Marple stood for some time before walking a little further along the path toward the side of the house. The curtains in the upper window twitched. She turned and found herself looking at the lodger. Mr. Lennox was thin and pale, with large round spectacles that gave him the look of a slightly startled owl. His voice, when he finally addressed her, was dry but polite. "Good morning," he said. "I don't suppose the constable sent you?" "Goodness, no," Miss Marple replied cheerfully. "I'm simply fond of gardens, though I confess this one has seen better days." He nodded without smiling. "I imagine the circumstances make flower beds seem a trifle inappropriate?" "Death rarely improves horticulture," Miss Marple agreed, "but it has a way of revealing what lies beneath." He said nothing, only adjusted his glasses. "I hear you were one of the last to see Mrs. Bledsoe alive." "I believe that's true," he said cautiously. She returned from the vicarage Sunday afternoon and looked quite pale. She mentioned she wasn't feeling well and asked not to be disturbed. "Did she often keep to herself?" Mr. Lennox shrugged. "I wouldn't know. I only rented the room. She was civil, but we didn't interact much. And the roast? Did you smell it burning?" He hesitated. "Eventually. But I thought she'd fallen asleep. It wasn't until morning that I realized something was wrong." Miss Marple gave him a long, thoughtful look. "You seem like a man who notices things." "I write for a living," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. "It's a habit. And what have you noticed since Sunday?" Mr. Lennox met her gaze. "You notice more than I do." Miss Marple gave a faint smile. "Observation is only half the trick. The other half is remembering what people forget to hide." As she walked away, the lodger remained at the window, unmoving. She did not need to look back to feel his eyes on her. By the time the sun dipped behind the steeple, another layer of the puzzle had emerged. Nora Bledsoe had changed her will. Harold Pike had known. Mr. Lennox had secrets, and Dottie Cray's stained smock, once just an artist's folly, now sat uneasily beside too many half-truths. The roast may have burned, but something far colder had been carefully served. The following day brought a change in the air, not of weather, but of tone. The polite hush that had settled over St. Mary Mead was giving way to tension, brittle and crackling like the first frost. The villagers, who prided themselves on civility, had begun to look over their shoulders a little more often. Small courtesies at the bakery were exchanged with an edge, and conversations were punctuated with meaningful glances. There had been a murder, after all, and worse, it had occurred among people who had, for years, passed sugar bowls and nodded across pews in the same parish. Miss Marple, ever observant and rarely idle, had spent the morning writing 2 letters and receiving 1 visitor. The visitor in question was Mrs. Lavinia Nash, a widow of keen interest in matters not her own, and a woman who could be counted on to provide a version of events that was both detailed and thoroughly embellished. Miss Marple had not summoned her, of course. She never did. But she had left her gate slightly ajar and her curtains slightly parted enough, in a village like theirs, to serve as an unspoken invitation. Lavinia had come bearing a plum cake and a mouthful of speculation. "My dear Jane," she began as she settled into the parlor chair, "this whole business has rattled me completely. I haven't slept a wink, and you know I sleep like a stone. Something must be done." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied gently, offering tea. "Milk and one lump, as always?" Lavinia gave a dramatic sigh. "Yes, thank you. I tell you, it's not just the murder. It's the lies. The pretense. I never liked that man she took in. Mr. Lennox, if that's even his real name. And Harold Pike, why? He walks about as though butter wouldn't melt. But I've seen him having heated words with the vicar's daughter on more than one occasion." Miss Marple raised her eyebrows just slightly. "Really? I hadn't realized Harold and Miss Gwen Clement were acquainted." "Oh, more than acquainted," Lavinia said with relish. "They've been seen walking by the river in the evenings. I dare say they're quite close." Miss Marple sipped her tea and said nothing. Lavinia, emboldened, pressed on. And Nora bled so well, I shouldn't speak ill of the dead, of course, but she was very firm about not liking young women. Jealous, perhaps, or simply bitter. Gwen Clement worked briefly at the library. You know, and Nora made a complaint, saying she was too forward with the borrowers. Miss Marple allowed herself a faint smile. It takes a great deal to be considered forward in a building full of books. "Yes, well," Lavinia said, brushing crumbs from her lap. Perhaps it wasn't the book she was interested in. The conversation drifted, as such conversations do, toward knitting patterns and a troubling shortage of cardamom at the grocer's. But Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on the implications Lavinia had laid out with such apparent carelessness. A romantic entanglement, a complaint, a legal clerk with knowledge of a new will, and a girl who might be inconvenient in more ways than one. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to the vicarage, not to Maud Clement this time, but to her daughter, Gwen. Gwen Clement was 24, bright-eyed, and often mistaken for far younger due to her modest manner and quiet voice. She answered the door with ink-stained fingers and an apologetic smile. "Oh, Miss Marple, how lovely. Do come in." They settled in the small drawing-room, where the windows overlooked the orchard and a half-knitted blanket lay draped over the arm of a chair. "I hope you won't mind me asking a rather delicate question." Miss Marple began after Gwen had produced tea and a plate of thin biscuits. Gwen's cheeks flushed. "Of course. Anything I can help with. Is it true that you were acquainted with Mr. Pike?" Gwen looked down, fiddling with the hem of her sleeve. "Yes. We've spoken. We walk together sometimes." Miss Marple waited. "We met at the fete last spring. He was kind, thoughtful. Not many people ask a vicar's daughter about her own thoughts, you know. They tend to speak at you. Not with you." "And Mrs. Bledsoe?" Gwen's smile faded. She didn't approve. "Of me, I mean. Once she saw us walking together, and the next day I heard she'd made a complaint to Mother. Said I was distracting Harold from his duties. And did he seem distracted?" A pause. "No," Gwen said quietly. "But he did seem nervous, like someone always watching a clock." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. When she returned home, dusk was falling fast. The lane was empty, save for a small brown cat, Mrs. Bledsoe, who sat on the garden wall as if it were still waiting for supper. Miss Marple paused to scratch behind her ears before letting herself inside. She lit the lamp and unfolded her notes. Possible motives. Harold Pike knowledge of the new will. Romance disapproved of by the deceased. Gwen Clement victim of complaint. Connection to Harold. Dottie Cray seen with parcel. Proximity. resentment. Mr. Lennox lodger, possibly false identity, evasive. And now a pattern is emerging, not of hatred, necessarily, but of inconvenience. Nora Bledsoe had, it seemed, grown less charitable in her widowhood. She had made enemies not through cruelty, but through interference. She had written a new will, mailed a letter, cooked a final roast, and been silenced. That evening, a small gathering formed at the church hall for the ladies' reading circle, a tradition that Miss Marple never missed. She arrived just in time for the discussion on the month's novel, a melodrama involving mistaken identity and poisoned teacups. As the ladies settled with their needlework and copies of the book, Miss Marple allowed herself one observation aloud. "I often wonder," she said, "why fictional poisonings are always so dramatic. One needn't resort to exotic herbs or ancient tinctures. A simple act, performed at the right moment, can be terribly effective." Dottie Cray looked up from her scarf in progress. "You sound as though you've considered it, Jane." "Oh, I wouldn't say that," Miss Marple replied with a smile. "But it's rather like knitting, isn't it? The result depends entirely on knowing where each thread must go and when to pull it." No one spoke for a moment. Then Mrs. Beale coughed lightly and changed the subject. Outside, the wind rustled the hedges like a whispered warning. The cat had vanished, and somewhere in the very room, or just beyond it, was someone who knew exactly what thread had been pulled and why. Miss Marple, her needles still, let her eyes wander from face to face. She was almost certain now, but not quite. By the time Thursday arrived in St. Mary Mead, the village felt less like a picture postcard and more like a teacup with a crack running through it. Conversations were shorter, glances sharper, and doors seemed to close just a little faster than usual. It wasn't that the villagers were openly frightened. Rather, they were caught in a quiet sort of disquiet, as if the presence of a murderer in their midst had nudged everything slightly off balance. Miss Marple, for her part, remained outwardly unchanged. She attended the flower committee meeting, inquired after the grocer's sick niece, and exchanged a recipe for plum jam with Mrs. Hartwell. But beneath the genteel exterior, her mind moved with quiet urgency. The threads were beginning to tangle in interesting ways. That morning she had made a brief visit to the post office, which also served as the village's informal information exchange. Miss Barnes, ever alert and never far from gossip, was dusting the ledge behind the parcel scales when Miss Marple stepped in. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, flicking her duster with exaggerated nonchalance. "You'll be wanting your magazines?" The gardening came in a bit late this week. "That's quite all right, dear," Miss Marple said kindly. "I wondered, actually, if you remember the red-sealed letter Mrs. Bledsoe sent shortly before her death." Miss Barnes paused, her duster mid-air. "Yes, of course. Very dramatic, that one. She brought it in on Saturday. Seemed in a bit of a state, truth be told. Do you recall where it was addressed?" Miss Barnes frowned, thinking. "Something about a solicitor's firm. Not here. One of those London addresses. But she didn't post it with the rest of the day's mail." "Oh? She paid for overnight delivery? Special courier. It cost a pretty penny." "How curious," Miss Marple murmured. "And do you know if it arrived?" "Well," Miss Barnes said, lowering her voice, "that's the funny part. The courier service rang this morning, said the letter never reached its destination. The van broke down somewhere on the A303, and when the driver returned to collect the post bag, that particular envelope was gone. They're calling it an internal mishap, but I dare say someone might have had a hand in it." Miss Marple thanked her, collected her magazines, and stepped out into the sun. Her face was calm, but her thoughts were racing. Someone had known about that letter, and someone had made very certain it would never be read. Back at home, she unfolded her notebook again and made a quiet mark beside Harold Pike's name. Red-sealed letter intercepted. Motive will? Means access. It was not enough. Not yet. She needed to know exactly what that letter contained, and there was only one person who might be able or willing to guess. By mid-afternoon, Miss Marple was knocking gently at the lodger's door. Mr. Lennox, pale as ever and twitchier than usual, answered with a wary look. "I wonder," Miss Marple said gently, "if you might indulge an old woman's curiosity. I believe Mrs. Bledsoe may have trusted you more than she let on." Mr. Lennox blinked behind his spectacles. "I wouldn't say that exactly. She mostly left me alone. But she spoke with you?" "Once or twice," he admitted, stepping aside to let her in. The room was modest and meticulously neat, perhaps, for someone supposedly writing a book. No drafts, no discarded pages. The only book in sight was a battered copy of Great Expectations beside the bed. She mentioned, briefly, that she had made changes to her will, he said, settling uneasily into the chair opposite her. Said she'd done the right thing at last. I asked no questions. That was wise, Miss Marple said. And did she mention whom she had written to? He hesitated. Only that it was a solicitor in London. She seemed determined, as if the matter had weighed on her. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Did she ever speak of Harold Pike? Lennox gave a short laugh, only to complain. He said he was polite to her face, but always watching the clock. That he had been trying to rush her into signing some document weeks ago. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. What sort of document? She didn't say anything, but she was suspicious enough not to sign it. She said she wanted outside advice, independent advice. And the next day, she posted a sealed letter to a solicitor in London, Miss Marple murmured. And is dead by supper. She rose, her voice soft but with a new firmness. Thank you, Mr. Lennox. I know you didn't much enjoy living under her roof, but I rather think you were the only one who listened to her. Lennox didn't respond. He merely watched her as she let herself out, the door clicking quietly behind her. That evening, as twilight gathered in folds over the rooftops, a fresh discussion unfolded in the drawing-room of Colonel Fenton, where he hosted his weekly cards and Scotch evening. Maud Clement, Dotty Cray, and Mrs. Beale were present, though Dotty mostly fiddled with the hem of her sleeve, clearly distracted. Colonel Fenton, emboldened by his second glass, offered a theory he'd been working on all week. "It's the lodger," he declared. "Mark my words. Writing a book, is he? Bah. That man hasn't written a shopping list since he got here. He's a fraud. Poison's a coward's weapon, and he looks the type." Dotty Cray gave a sharp shake of her head. "That's too easy. I may not have liked Nora, but she wasn't stupid. She'd never have taken food from someone she didn't trust. She was proud of her roasts." Maud Clement looked troubled. She left our luncheon early that day and said she had to check the oven. Mrs. Beale leaned forward. "You think the poison was already waiting in the roast?" "Or the gravy," said Dotty, grimacing. She was always particular about her sauces. Colonel Fenton harumphed. "None of this changes the facts. Whoever did it must have known about that letter." "That's the key." Dotty paled slightly. "What letter?" "Oh, some solicitor business," the Colonel said dismissively. "Supposed to go to London. Never arrived. Suspicious, if you ask me." Dotty rose abruptly. "Excuse me, I've just remembered I left something on the stove." She left the room too quickly, the door swinging behind her like a question left unanswered. Miss Marple, who had not been invited but had already heard the account in full from Mrs. Beale by nightfall, sat quietly by her fireplace that evening. The flames flickered, casting shadows across the lace curtains. Dotty was frightened. Harold Pike was nervous. Mr. Lennox was hiding something more than unfinished chapters, and a red-sealed letter had gone missing. But the real clue, she suspected, had not yet been spoken. It was lying just out of sight. like the final piece in a jigsaw, tucked under the edge of the table. Waiting. Friday dawned with a bruised sky and a stiff breeze rustling through the hedgerows, as though the village itself was preparing to shed something. There was a nervous energy in the air imperceptible to those unaccustomed to the subtle shifts of country life, but to Miss Marple it was as clear as church bells on a Sunday morning. Things were beginning to come loose. After a brief visit to the baker, who was now packaging loaves with near silent efficiency, Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage. Maud Clement had sent word earlier that she was unsettled and would appreciate a quiet chat, and Miss Marple, never one to ignore a tremor on the surface, responded promptly. She arrived to find Maud in the parlor, wringing a lace-edged handkerchief and glancing toward the closed door of the study. "I'm so glad you came," Maud said in a low voice. "There's something odd, Jane." Miss Marple sat without removing her gloves. "Tell me." "It's Gwen," Maud said, looking distressed. "She's hardly spoken since Wednesday. She's pale, and well, this morning I found her crying in the garden. She wouldn't say why." Miss Marple's brows lifted. "Did she mention Harold Pike?" Maud nodded, her face drawn. "She said he's been avoiding her, that he seemed nervous and distant since the Sunday lunch." "She cares for him," Miss Marple said gently, more a statement than a question. "Yes," Maud whispered, "and I suspect he cares for her, in his own way, but something has changed." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Has Gwen ever mentioned being approached about Nora Bledsoe's affairs? A will, perhaps?" "No," Maud replied, "but there was a parcel Harold gave her to deliver. She didn't say much, only that he said it was a gift for someone elderly, something to cheer them up. And this was before or after the roast dinner?" "Before. Saturday, I think." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Did she say who the gift was for?" Maud frowned. "No, and I didn't press. I assumed it was for one of the ladies from the sewing circle." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And the parcel, what did it look like?" "Oh, she never described it, but I did notice her come in that afternoon with a silver-domed dish. One of those old-fashioned ones you sometimes see in hotel dining rooms. Very polished. She tucked it into the cupboard like it was something borrowed." Miss Marple stood. "Maud, may I speak with Gwen?" Maud hesitated, then nodded and led her upstairs to the girl's room. Gwen Clement was seated by the window, her shoulders hunched, staring blankly at a rain-dappled pane. When Miss Marple entered, she didn't turn her head. "I'm not angry," Miss Marple said quietly. "I'm only trying to understand." Gwen sniffled. "I didn't do anything wrong, Miss Marple. I swear it." "Sometimes, dear," Miss Marple said, settling beside her, "we become part of something wrong without realizing it, until it's too late." Gwen wiped her eyes. "He asked me to deliver something. To Nora. He said it was a meal of some kind, since she'd been unwell. Said it was from the vicarage, so she wouldn't think it unusual." "A meal?" Miss Marple asked softly. Gwen nodded. "A meat pie. In one of those covered dishes from the parish kitchen. He said to knock, leave it on the step and walk away." She wouldn't answer the door, but she'd know it was there. Miss Marple felt her stomach tighten. "And you did as he asked?" "Yes," Gwen whispered. "It was on Saturday. I didn't think about it until the next day after she was dead. And even then, I didn't want to believe you still don't," Miss Marple said gently, "because if it were true, it would break your heart." Gwen nodded miserably. "Did you ever open the dish, or notice anything unusual?" "Number, it smelled fine, just like lamb and rosemary. And it was warm. I was only at the door for seconds." Miss Marple took her hand. "You're very brave, Gwen. But I believe someone may have used your good nature to their advantage." Gwen squeezed her eyes shut. "I didn't know. I didn't know." Back at her cottage, Miss Marple poured herself a tepid cup of tea and stared at the fire, which had burned low. Her notebook was filling rapidly with new names, timings, objects, and inconsistencies. The pieces were beginning to lock together, but still there were two missing corners. She rang Inspector Craythorne just past 4. "Inspector, I hope I'm not disturbing you. I wonder if your men have checked the dish cupboards at the vicarage." There was a pause. "Dish cupboards, Miss Marple?" "Yes. Specifically for a domed serving dish. I believe it may still be there." The inspector, no longer questioning the peculiar nature of her deductions, promised to investigate. By 6 o'clock, he rang her back. "You were right. It was tucked behind a stack of soup tureens. And there's something else. The inner lining was scrubbed clean, but beneath the polish, we found residue. Arsenic." Miss Marple's lips thinned. "So not cyanide, then. That explains the lack of almond scent. Arsenic has no taste or smell, and given enough time, it mimics illness, nausea, fatigue, and all the signs of a poor constitution. You believe it was delivered as a separate meal?" "I believe someone didn't trust the roast would suffice or feared Nora wouldn't eat it at all." She paused. "And the courier van, the red-sealed letter?" "Still missing. But we found tire tracks in a side lane near the post office. Someone intercepted it, quite deliberately." "Then I suggest," Miss Marple said quietly, "you have your constable pay a visit to Harold Pike. Do you believe he poisoned her?" "I believe," Miss Marple replied. "He prepared the package, but I'm not yet sure whose instructions he was following or whether he knew what was inside." She hung up, folded her hands in her lap, and looked out at the garden, where the dusk had turned the marigolds to silhouettes. One more thread. One more knot in the tapestry. Someone had intercepted the letter. Someone had abused Gwen's affection. Someone had known that Nora Bledsoe's suspicions might become a threat, and someone still was hiding in plain sight. But not for much longer. The next day, St. Mary Mead awoke to a sky the color of pewter and a wind that tugged irritably at garden gates and washing lines. It was the sort of weather that made people speak in hushed tones, as though the sky itself were listening. But beneath the gloom, something was stirring a shift in the atmosphere, not caused by barometric pressure, but by something far more human. Miss Marple had finished her second cup of breakfast tea and tucked her knitting into her basket when she made her decision. The time for passive observation was over. It was now time to engage the web. She began by paying a visit to Mrs. Beale's shop, where the village's informal newswire hummed just beneath the scent of apples and root vegetables. Mrs. Beale herself was behind the till, sorting onions with a distracted expression. "Good morning, Jane," she said, peering over her spectacles. "You've heard about young Mr. Pike, I suppose?" Miss Marple offered a calm smile. "Only that he's been asked a few questions. Nothing official, I believe?" "Not yet," Mrs. Beale said meaningfully. "But Dottie Cray says the constable was round to the solicitor's office yesterday and Harold didn't return after lunch. Just vanished. No one's seen him since." "Curious," Miss Marple replied, selecting a head of cabbage with care. "One might think he had something to hide." Mrs. Beale's eyes narrowed. "Or someone to protect." Miss Marple said nothing, but the comment lodged itself like a pin on a board. She made 2 more stops before returning home. The first was at the vicarage, to see Gwen, who looked pale but composed, as though tears had given way to resolution. The second was to the Red Fox Inn, where Mr. Ellis, 3 pints deep, was telling anyone who would listen that he had always known. Harold Pike had too many teeth in his smile. Just the sort of young man who acts like he's got a silver spoon and a set of forged papers, Ellis mumbled. "Mark my words, always too polite, too clean, doesn't belong here." Miss Marple did not linger long. She had heard enough. That afternoon she prepared her parlour for a gathering. Nothing formal, just tea and scones and a few carefully chosen guests. The invitations had been delivered discreetly. with Miss Marple's usual unassuming charm. By 4 o'clock, the sun had broken through the clouds in narrow golden streaks, and the fire in the hearth crackled gently. Dotty Cray arrived first, looking pinched and jittery. Then came Colonel Fenton, as gruff and dismissive as ever. And finally Maud Clement, who sat quietly in the corner, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I do hope you'll forgive me for the impromptu invitation," Miss Marple said as she poured the tea. "I've been feeling the weight of all this dreadful business and thought perhaps we might ease it together. After all, we've each been touched by it in some way." "Too right we have," muttered the Colonel. "The village is crawling with whispers and ghost stories. Never seen such rot." Dotty clutched her teacup. "It's not ghosts I worry about." Miss Marple offered her a kind glance. "No, dear, it's the living who trouble us most." There was a silence as the room absorbed this. "I've been thinking," Miss Marple continued casually, "about how peculiar it was that red-sealed letter went missing." "Rather like a magician's trick, wouldn't you say?" Colonel Fenton grunted. "Too convenient by half." "Indeed, and yet," Miss Marple mused, stirring her tea, "what if it wasn't meant to reach London at all? What if it was simply meant to disappear?" Maud looked up sharply. "You mean someone here knew about it?" "I think someone knew exactly what was in that letter," Miss Marple said softly, "and feared it would change everything." Dotty's teacup clinked loudly against its saucer. "I didn't take it," she said suddenly. "I didn't even know about it until the other night." "No one is accusing you," Miss Marple replied. "But you were seen near the Bledsoe house with a parcel, and I happen to know you own a rather distinctive silver serving dish, very similar to the one found hidden at the vicarage." Dotty flushed. "I lent it to Gwen. Weeks ago. She said her mother was short on serving-ware for the luncheon." "Did she return it directly to you?" Miss Marple asked gently. No, I think Maud brought it round." All eyes turned to Maud, whose expression had frozen. "I did," Maud said faintly, "but only because Gwen asked me to. I didn't know anything about it." "I believe you, Maud," Miss Marple said quietly. "But I think someone else did. Someone who recognized that dish and used it as a vessel not for kindness, but for murder." The fire cracked. Colonel Fenton shifted uncomfortably. "And what of Harold Pike?" he said. "If anyone had cause, it was him. The will, the inheritance. He stood to lose everything if she changed it." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "But Harold Pike has no history of violence, no cunning. He's clever in documents, not in death, and yet someone manipulated Gwen in his stead, perhaps to distance themselves from the act." A long pause followed. Dotty opened her mouth to speak, then shut it again. Finally, Miss Marple said, "The poison was hidden in plain sight, just as the letter was. But what matters now is the motive, not just to kill, but to silence." Nora Bledsoe was making changes. She was beginning to see the truth about someone. Maud whispered, "But who?" Before Miss Marple could answer, there was a knock at the door. It was Inspector Craythorne. "Apologies for the interruption," he said, glancing around the room. "We've found Harold Pike. He's at his sister's in Eastbourne. He says he fled because he feared he'd be blamed." Dotty let out a shaky breath. "And there's something else," the inspector added. "The red-sealed letter wasn't lost, after all. It was found in a hedgerow off Bletchley Lane. Torn open. The contents are gone." Miss Marple nodded, her expression grave. "Then we're very close indeed." As Craythorne departed, the guests exchanged uneasy glances. Miss Marple, standing by the window, watched the wind stir the hedge outside. She had set the trap. Now all she had to do was wait and watch for who stepped into it. The morning after Miss Marple's tea gathering broke clear and quiet. The wind was finally still and the clouds parted like a curtain before a play's final act. St. Mary Mead, deceptively calm in its appearance stirred beneath its orderly surface with a mounting pressure and awareness shared in glances and murmurs that something was coming to a head. Word had spread, of course, as it always did, that Harold Pike had fled, that the letter had been found torn, violated, and useless, that Dotty Cray had gone nearly white when questioned, that Miss Marple had gathered her own quiet court in her parlour and spoken with the softness of someone who knew more than she was saying. By 10 o'clock, Inspector Craythorne stood once again at the vicarage gates, flanked by Constable Arnold, his face pinched with the weight of sleepless hours and a growing certainty that this case had always been about more than just poison and inheritance. Maud Clement greeted them with visible confusion. Gwen, pale and composed, hovered in the hallway behind her mother, hands clasped in front of her apron like a schoolgirl awaiting rebuke. Inspector Maud said, "Is there some news?" "There is," Craythorne said gently. "And we'd like to speak with Gwen if she's well enough." Maud turned to her daughter, uncertain. "I'll speak with him, Mother," Gwen said softly. "I've nothing to hide." They led her to the small sitting room where sermons were written and quiet crises soothed. The room smelled faintly of wood polish and lavender, with the lace curtains drawn halfway to soften the morning glare. Craythorne sat opposite her, notebook ready. "Miss Clement, this won't take long. I understand you helped deliver a parcel to Mrs. Bledsoe the day before her death." Gwen nodded. "Yes, it was a covered dish. Harold said it was a gift. Something kind. And did he tell you what was inside?" "No," Gwen replied, her voice barely audible. "Just that it was a meal. He said Nora hadn't been well and this might lift her spirits." Craythorne exchanged a glance with the constable, then leaned in. "Gwen, you do understand how serious this is. The dish you delivered contained food laced with arsenic." She froze. Her lips parted, but no sound emerged at first. "I didn't know," she said finally. "I swear I didn't. Did Mr. Pike ask you to return the dish afterward?" Gwen shook her head. "Number, I didn't think about it. I suppose I assumed Mrs. Bledsoe would return it herself. And did anyone else know you delivered it?" "I don't think so," Gwen said. "Only Mother. She saw me take it. I didn't mention it to anyone else." Craythorne nodded slowly. "Very well. That's all for now." Back at Miss Marple's cottage, the detective in question was already preparing for what she knew would be a decisive day. Her notebook now resembled a puzzle box, with scribbled margins filled with initials, arrows, and circled times. She had marked out timelines, cross-checked parcel sightings, and noted every inconsistency from every tea-time confession and hallway whisper. But one detail remained stubbornly loose. The key. On Sunday morning, mere hours before the discovery of the crime, Mrs. Clement had mentioned misplacing the small brass key that locked the vicarage study cabinet. It had held little importance at the time, a passing anecdote during the washing up, but now, with fresh eyes, Miss Marple saw it differently. That cabinet contained personal parish files, documents with parishioners' names, donations, and letters. And, notably, a duplicate of the parish silverware inventory kept since the Fate burglary years ago. And among that inventory was a silver serving dome from the same set Gwen had borrowed. Miss Marple took a slow breath, then rose and made her way, unannounced, to the vicarage once more. This time, Maud answered the door with slightly reddened eyes. She looked older than she had just the day before, the burden of suspicion now resting within her own household. "Jane," she said faintly, "please come in." Miss Marple stepped inside, setting her gloves down carefully. "Maud, I wonder if I might look at your study cabinet, the one you said had a missing key." Maud blinked. "Why?" "Because I believe it was opened. Not by you, but by someone who needed access to something it contained, perhaps that inventory list." to confirm that the dish would go unnoticed or that it could be replaced without question. Maud hesitated, then slowly led her to the study. The cabinet in question was tucked beside the writing desk, its brass lock dull with age. "I still haven't found the key," she said. Though I meant to, Miss Marple reached into her reticule and held out a small brass object. Maud gasped. "Where? How?" "I found it yesterday," Miss Marple said, "tucked beneath your garden bench. Someone must have dropped it while returning from the shed, possibly after replacing the silver dome." Maud stared, then sat slowly on the edge of the desk. "Do you think someone is in this house?" "I think," Miss Marple said, her voice low, "that the murder was orchestrated by someone who needed it to appear as if Harold Pike had the most to lose." Maud looked stricken. "Jane, you can't think Gwen." "No," Miss Marple said firmly. "I believe Gwen was used, but the person who manipulated her, who arranged for the letter to vanish, the meal to be delivered, and the silver to be hidden, had a more personal reason. Not financial. Emotional." Maud paled. Oh, dear heavens. At that moment, Constable Arnold burst through the door without knocking, breathless and wide-eyed. "The inspector says you're to come at once," he panted. "There's been another incident." Maud gasped. "What sort of incident?" "At the Red Fox Inn," he said. "Dottie Cray was just found collapsed in the back storeroom. She's alive, barely. She said she drank something by mistake." Miss Marple's face tightened. "Something meant for someone else, I suspect." She turned back to Maud. "Where is Gwen?" Maud stood abruptly. "She went out walking after the inspector left. She hasn't returned." Miss Marple took only a moment to grab her gloves. "Then I suggest we find her before someone else does." Outside, the clouds had thickened once again. The village, which had for days simmered with secrets, was finally beginning to boil. One had tried to run. One had nearly died. One was missing, and only one quiet, sharp-eyed person, forgotten by all but a few, was stitching the final pieces together. Miss Marple. The wind had returned by mid-afternoon, ushering in a sudden squall of fine mist that blurred the hedgerows and soaked the garden paths. Rain tapped urgently against the cottage roofs of St. Mary Mead, as if the sky itself had grown impatient with secrecy. Within the grey hush, the village felt close to breaking a tension thick as broth simmering over too hot a flame. Miss Marple stood on the vicarage porch beneath her umbrella, her gloves clutched in one hand, eyes sweeping the lane with practiced calm. The constable's news of Dottie Cray's poisoning had struck like a dropped teacup, sharp, unexpected, and revealing. But Miss Marple knew the gesture had not been one of panic. Number It had been calculated, controlled. Someone was tying off loose ends, or so they thought. Gwen Clement was still missing. The walk to the Red Fox Inn was slow, her pace steady but purposeful. As she passed the post office, Miss Barnes peered out from behind her blinds, her mouth an unspoken question. The grocer paused halfway through arranging his lemons. The village watched her progress like a parade of one. At the inn, Inspector Craythorne met her at the rear entrance. His hat was soaked through, his coat speckled with rain. Behind him, the interior of the Red Fox was dim and hushed. The usual din of tankards and laughter had evaporated, replaced by murmurs and unease. "She's stable," he said. "Dottie. A pint of ale laced with something bitter. Arsenic again, we believe. The barkeep says she poured it herself." "Was it intended for her?" Miss Marple asked. Craythorne hesitated. "That's the question, isn't it? Where was it left?" "On the counter. Middle tap. The regular spot for Colonel Fenton's usual." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Ah. And has Colonel Fenton arrived today?" "No," said Craythorne. "Sent word he wasn't feeling well." "Convenient," she murmured. They walked together toward the storeroom where Dotty had been found. The scent of damp burlap and old hops lingered in the air, and a half-finished crate of onions stood beside the wall. Dotty's shawl, dark blue and flecked with specks of lint, had been folded and left neatly atop an empty barrel. "She didn't fight," said the constable who had first arrived on the scene. "Just slumped, quiet as anything." "Dotty was many things," Miss Marple said softly, "but not a fool. If she drank it, she did so knowing something." A knock at the main entrance interrupted them. It was Maud Clement, cheeks flushed from wind and worry. "Gwen's home," she said quickly. "She came back not long ago. She said she'd just gone to the old footbridge to think. She's shaken, but safe." Miss Marple exhaled. Thank goodness. Then the circle tightens. Craythorne looked at her. "Meaning?" "Meaning," she said. "Whoever tried to kill Dotty thought she was the only one left who could speak with certainty about the dish, its origin, and its timing. But Gwen is still here, which means we still have time." Later that evening, a gathering took place once again at Miss Marple's cottage. Smaller this time and far tenser. The fire crackled with the occasional hiss of damp wood, casting uncertain shadows across the parlor. Present were Gwen Clement, pale but composed. Colonel Fenton, surprisingly present after all, clutching a handkerchief and complaining of nerves and chills. Maud Clement, who had not left Gwen's side since her return, and Inspector Craythorne, silent, watching everyone. Dotty Cray was absent, of course, recuperating in her own home under constable watch, but her name lingered in the air like an unfinished sentence. Miss Marple passed the teapot slowly, pausing beside Colonel Fenton. "You're looking stronger than expected, Colonel. We feared you were taken ill." "Ah," he grunted, not meeting her eyes. "Just a headache. Change in pressure. Always does me in." "Curious," she said mildly, "as you were seen at the pharmacy yesterday morning, asking for something to ease indigestion." The Colonel frowned. "Yes, well, digestion too. A bit of everything this week." "Indeed," she murmured. "And it must have been quite a coincidence that Dotty Cray drank from a glass you normally claim at the inn." Colonel Fenton straightened. "Are you suggesting I poisoned her?" "Nonsense. I wasn't even there." "Exactly," said Miss Marple. "And Dotty was." The room went still. "She was always sharp," Miss Marple continued, "always nosing about, remembering details others forgot. She knew that Gwen didn't return the dish. She knew that the silver lid had a flawed scratch along the rim. It had been dropped once, years ago, during a spring fair. She recognized it because she lent it." Gwen shifted in her chair. "I never knew that," she whispered. "Dotty did," said Miss Marple. "And I believe she told someone she was going to the police." Colonel Fenton's hand trembled slightly. Miss Marple turned to Gwen. "Gwen, may I ask, did Harold ever tell you where he got the dish?" "No," she replied. "He just said it was borrowed from the vicarage kitchen." Miss Marple nodded. "But it wasn't. It was hidden there later, after the fact." Maud gasped softly. "You mean Harold didn't prepare the meal?" "No," Miss Marple said. "He believed he was delivering something from the parish kitchen, a small kindness for a grieving widow, but someone gave him the prepared dish, already laced, sealed, ready." Her gaze moved deliberately to Colonel Fenton. "You always said Nora Bledsoe was too nosy," Miss Marple said. "Too interfering. She threatened your standing at the parish council, publicly disagreed with your proposals. And recently, I believe, she began threatening to reveal something more personal." Craythorne looked up sharply. "Reveal what?" Miss Marple turned to him. "The Colonel had dealings with Nora's late husband, old investment schemes. Not strictly legal. Harold Bledsoe took the blame after his fall from the bank's good graces, but I believe Nora found letters and was planning to expose what really happened. The letter to the solicitor likely detailed everything." "You've no proof," Colonel Fenton said gruffly. but there was sweat along his brow now and a red patch blooming at his throat. "No," Miss Marple said gently. "But Dotty did, and now she's lying in bed, poisoned by a drink never meant for her." Colonel Fenton rose abruptly, the chair legs scraping the floor. "I won't sit here and be insulted," he snapped. "This is all hearsay. Gossip, you've no idea." "No," Miss Marple said again, "but I watched how you reacted when I mentioned the scratch on the lid. You winced, and you've been ill ever since, not from nerves or from fear." Craythorne stood. "Colonel, I think you'd better come with me. I won't be paraded like a criminal." "No one said you were under arrest," Craythorne said calmly. "But there are questions to answer, and perhaps Dotty Cray will have a few of her own when she wakes." The colonel stared at them, jaw clenched, then turned sharply and walked out without another word. When the door closed behind him, Gwen burst into quiet sobs. Maud gathered her in her arms, while Miss Marple turned to the window, watching the night wind chase fallen leaves down the lane. The killer hadn't confessed, but the mask had cracked, and the final stitch was ready to be drawn. The wind had softened by morning, replaced with a strange, weightless stillness. St. Mary Mead seemed suspended in time, like a painting just before the final brush stroke. It was the kind of day where sound traveled farther and silences seemed deeper. For all its tidy calm, the village had become a place of waiting for someone to speak the truth aloud. At her cottage, Miss Marple arranged the chrysanthemums in her parlor with great care. White and gold, the kind Mrs. Bledsoe had once favored for the harvest altar. The gesture wasn't sentimental, it was calculated. Every object in her home, every phrase she intended to speak later that day, was part of a structure now, a final trap, not of malice, but of logic and memory. Dotty Cray remained in stable condition. Inspector Craythorne had reported over the telephone. Still too weak for visitors, but alive and, more importantly, asking questions. Miss Marple had nodded quietly at the news. She knew the killer's nerves would be fraying now. Poisoners, in her experience, could bear silence but not uncertainty. At 10 o'clock, she made her way to the churchyard. The old footbridge where Gwen had walked days ago lay just beyond it, arching modestly over the stream. She paused there, watching water flow over mossy stones. She was not alone. Colonel Fenton stood on the far side, his back turned. He didn't startle when she approached, only straightened his shoulders and turned with a soldier's dignity. "Come to say more, Miss Marple?" he asked, his voice gruff. "I've come to listen," she replied gently. "Sometimes that's all a person needs in the end." He gave a humorless laugh. "You've already made up your mind." "About the means, yes. What about the mind behind it?" "I prefer to let that speak for itself." Fenton looked out toward the field. "You think I killed Nora Bledsoe to hide some dusty mistake from 20 years ago?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that someone saw the house of cards they built starting to tremble. Nora was inconvenient, not only for what she knew but also for whom she was willing to protect." He frowned. "Protect? She had made changes to her will, yes. But I believe she also wrote to her solicitor about a second matter, a confession of sorts, something that might implicate her late husband and others. But the letter never arrived. And Dotty Cray, perhaps, knew why." The colonel's hands tightened around his cane. "She was gossiping. She was an observer," Miss Marple corrected, "and that made her dangerous to anyone hiding something." They stood in silence. A robin chirped from a hedge. A single brown leaf floated down and landed near the colonel's shoe. He bent to pick it up too quickly, almost defensively, and Miss Marple saw the tremor in his fingers. "You're not obliged to say anything, Colonel," she said softly. "But I would ask you this. If you had one moment left to set something right, not for yourself, but for someone who once trusted you, what would you do with it?" Fenton looked away. "I served," he he said at last. In North Africa. Burma. I've been shot at. Lost men. Seen the worst of what people can become when fear drives them, but nothing prepares you for the fear of losing what you've built slowly, brick by brick. Miss Marple didn't interrupt. I was never cruel, he went on. Never unkind. I only did what was necessary. The sentence hovered in the air like fog. She gave a slow nod. I understand. They parted without another word. By midday, Inspector Craythorne had returned to the village, bringing with him a sealed packet recovered from the late Mr. Bledsoe's former bank branch documents transferred to a holding file after his fall from grace. One of them, signed in faded ink, implicated a small group of private investors, including, as Miss Marple had long suspected, Colonel Fenton. That afternoon, Miss Marple invited Harold Pike to tea. He arrived looking thinner, tired, and utterly broken by the weight of suspicion. I didn't do it, he said the moment he sat down. I know, Miss Marple replied. But someone used you. Harold dropped his gaze. I should have questioned it. The dish, the secrecy. But I thought it was just eccentricity, something charitable. And yet you didn't tell anyone, not even Gwen. He looked ashamed. I didn't want to complicate things. Miss Marple poured tea. You must understand, Harold. Poisoners don't need to be clever. They need to be ordinary, overlooked. That's how they operate, in plain sight, under the guise of routine. He said nothing. Did you ever meet Colonel Fenton privately? She asked. Harold hesitated. He called on me once, after Mr. Bledsoe died, said there were financial documents best left buried. Miss Marple's hands stilled on the teapot. And you agreed? I said I'd think about it, he whispered, but he never mentioned it again. Not directly. And did Nora know? Harold shook his head. She never spoke of it. But toward the end, she started locking drawers, whispering to herself. I think she knew something was coming. Miss Marple nodded. Thank you, Harold. You've told me enough. Later that evening, Miss Marple returned to the church hall under the guise of preparing bunting for an upcoming flower show. She had, of course, invited the usual volunteers, Maud, Gwen, and Mrs. Beale, and, through careful prompting, had sent word to Colonel Fenton that his help might be appreciated. He arrived half an hour late, cane tapping against the flagstones, face stiff with propriety. As they worked in silence, cutting crepe paper and arranging ribbons, Miss Marple posed her question. I've often wondered, she said to the room at large, why would someone poison a roast and send a second dish? It seems excessive. No one spoke. Unless, she continued, the roast wasn't the murder weapon at all. Perhaps it was never eaten. Perhaps the poisoner never intended it to be. Fenton's eyes flicked to hers, just once. Miss Marple turned to Maud. Maud, did you notice anything odd when Nora left your luncheon that day? She was in a hurry, Maud said slowly. But I do recall something now. She refused the pudding. She said her roast needed basting. I remember because I thought it peculiar that she was never fond of sweets, but she rarely left so quickly. She wanted to avoid eating anything, Miss Marple said, even a simple crumble, because she suspected something. Mrs. Beale gasped softly. I think Nora knew she was being watched. I think she knew someone had tampered with her food, but she underestimated how far they'd go. And when she received that domed dish later that evening, gifted, as it were, from the church kitchen, she assumed it safe. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the room. No one prepares poison without planning, but the risk isn't just the act. It's the silence that follows. Silence requires confidence, and confidence often reveals the guilty more than fear. Colonel Fenton's voice was dry. Then why am I still sitting here? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Because poisoners believe they are untouchable, until the smallest truth undoes them. He held her gaze. "Would you care for a cup of tea, Colonel?" she asked. Fenton paused. "No," he said. "Not today." Miss Marple nodded. And that, she knew, was the final stitch in the tapestry. The unraveling would begin tomorrow, and with it, the truth. The rain had returned by morning, soft and persistent, tapping against the panes of Miss Marple's parlour, as though urging her onward. It brought with it a sense of finality, the kind of atmosphere that made people draw curtains early and speak in lowered voices. The village, though quiet, had gathered at its metaphorical edge. There had been too many whispers, too many near-truths. Now the time has come for clarity. Miss Marple had arranged for a small gathering at the vicarage. Not at the church hall, not in the public square, but in the same sitting room where Sunday teas and village plans were usually discussed in the gentlest tones. It was deliberate. The place needed to be familiar and harmless, so the weight of truth might be carried more gently. She had requested the presence of Maud Clement, Gwen, Harold Pike, Inspector Craythorne, and, of course, Colonel Fenton. Dotty Cray had not yet recovered enough to attend, but her account had already been delivered in writing, sharp, lucid, and damning in its subtle observations. They sat as if for an ordinary village meeting. A teapot sat steaming on the table between them. No one reached for it. Miss Marple stood, hands gently clasped before her. "I want to thank you all for coming," she said in that calm, lilting voice that had so often coaxed truth from silence. "There is a matter I feel we must now resolve fully and with care, so that the village may rest again, and so that Mrs. Bledsoe may finally be spoken of with the dignity she deserves." Gwen shifted in her chair. Harold Pike's eyes stayed fixed on the floor. Colonel Fenton looked toward the window, jaw rigid. Miss Marple continued. "The death of Nora Bledsoe was not a random act, nor was it the result of madness or some delayed grief. It was, simply and terribly, a carefully planned murder designed to silence her and to disguise the motive behind a veil of domestic routine." Craythorne gave a small nod. "The poison was arsenic. That much we know. And we also know it was not present in the roast Mrs. Bledsoe left to cook while she attended Sunday luncheon at the vicarage." She turned to Maud. "Maud, you remember she left rather abruptly?" "Yes." "Yes," Maud replied softly. "She said her roast needed basting." "A curious excuse," Miss Marple said. "For the roast had only been in the oven a short while, but I believe she used that as a reason to excuse herself before pudding. She was suspicious. Perhaps she'd already noticed someone watching her, or perhaps she intended to avoid eating altogether. But it was the second meal, the one delivered by Gwen on Harold Pike's request, that carried the poison." Harold looked up then, stricken. "I didn't know. I swear. I thought it was something kind, something for comfort." "I believe you," Miss Marple said gently. "You were chosen precisely because you are kind. And Gwen was chosen because she was trusted. The true culprit needed hands to deliver the fatal package without drawing attention." She turned now to Colonel Fenton, whose eyes remained on the grey sky beyond the glass. "The silver dome used to conceal the meal came from the parish kitchen, yes, but it had been borrowed months ago and never returned." Dotty Cray recognized it immediately. It bore a small scratch, hard to notice but distinct. She knew she had lent it, and when she learned of its reappearance, she began asking quiet questions. Fenton gave no reply. She intended to speak with Inspector Craythorne the morning after Nora's death, but someone got to her first, an arsenic-laced pint at the Red Fox, served in the exact glass Colonel Fenton usually claimed as his own. Craythorne stepped forward slightly. "We checked with the innkeeper. He says the glass had been cleaned, yes, but someone accessed the bar storage the evening prior." Miss Marple continued, her voice still soft. "The red-sealed letter Mrs. Bledsoe posted, intended for her solicitor, was intercepted. torn and discarded. But its purpose was clear. Inside, I believe, was a confession of sorts. She had found documents, perhaps old correspondence, linking her late husband's financial ruin not solely to himself, but to others. "Colonel, I believe you were one of them." Fenton spoke then, low and brittle. "She would have destroyed everything I'd rebuilt. Over a handful of letters, decades old. She couldn't leave well enough alone." "She believed the truth was not something one buried," Miss Marple replied. The room fell into a weighted silence. Gwen reached out for her mother's hand. Craythorne cleared his throat. "She prepared the meal herself," Miss Marple said. "Not Nora, not Harold, not Gwen. She wrapped it in cloth, sealed it in the domed dish, and passed it off as a kind gesture. It was anything but." Fenton's shoulders slumped slightly. "I didn't mean to involve the girl." "But you did," Miss Marple said, not unkindly. "And had Dottie Cray not been a light drinker with a strong constitution, you might have silenced her too." Craythorne stepped forward. "Colonel Fenton, I must ask you to come with me." There was no struggle, no denial. Fenton simply rose, brushed imaginary dust from his lapel, and nodded. Miss Marple stepped aside, allowing the inspector and the colonel to pass. When the door closed behind them, the quiet seemed to stretch wider than before. Maud wept softly. Gwen stared into her lap. Harold sat still, as though carved from stone. Miss Marple poured a cup of tea. She handed it to Maud with both hands. "The truth," she said quietly, "is rarely comforting, but it clears the air, and in time, even pain begins to breathe again." Outside, the clouds had begun to part, revealing blue sky beyond. It was pale and fragile, but it was there. The following Sunday, the church was full. The harvest altar had been decorated with chrysanthemums again, their white and gold petals glimmering in the morning light. A small plaque had been placed beside them. "In memory of Nora Bledsoe. Honest, watchful, and unafraid." And in the back pew, as always, Miss Marple sat quietly, hands folded, eyes soft with memory. The village, for all its wounds, had begun to mend, and behind every cottage window, every passing nod, and every second cup of tea, there lingered the quiet knowledge that Miss Marple had once again reminded them it is not always the loudest voices that find justice. Sometimes it is the quiet ones, the ones who listen and never forget.